working with TEKsystems for a little over 9 years now. January was my 9-year anniversary, and I've been what I would consider pretty blessed to get to work with that entire time, that entire 9 years being focused on the design space. And even when I first joined, that was still kind of when we were admittedly as a company trying to figure out the design space and what that really meant to be a designer. I think a lot of the industry, not the design industry, but I think a lot of companies out there were still trying to figure out what that really meant and beginning to go through their changes. So it's kind of cool to be a part of that and kind of see how it's evolved over the years. My main, I live here in San Antonio. Have a few main clients here, but out of all of my partners in San Antonio, we focus on most of the, I'd say, large clients that you can think of. There are definitely some that probably come to mind for folks who are local here, but outside of that, we also work, we have over 90 offices across the US. We even have offices over in Asia. We have offices over in Europe. So just because I might talk about things from a micro level of San Antonio, I also have access to data from across the entire country, right? So yeah, I'll kind of leave my little intro at that. As you can tell, I don't necessarily like talking about myself all that much, but so I think this conversation is going to be good, because that's really what I'm hoping that it's more of, is a true dialogue, a conversation, right? So with that, what do you guys want to talk about? I am open to answer whatever I can.
I have a question,
Yeah.
if you don't mind me kicking off. So what can you tell us about sort of the general trends and direction of hiring and layoffs in the current climate? Because it seems like in terms of the economy, we know we're in kind of a recession. It hit tech first, and then, as it hits tech, it kind of has a domino effect on other industries. What can you tell us about that in terms of UX research, and you being a recruiter? Like, what have you seen? Do you have any predictions that we won't hold you accountable for, but just general thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and I probably should have said this at the beginning. Nothing I say, I hope nothing I say is viewed as like gospel in UX recruiting or hiring or anything. These are just my opinions and just my thoughts based on what I've seen, right? So I want to preface that and give that little disclaimer. To answer your question though, I have seen, because obviously there has been that the abundant layoffs on the tech side, right? And you're right, it does, trends do seem to follow whatever happens in the technology side of the house. That said, I probably like 3 months ago, I was telling Adrian before this, was having a conversation with a director that I work with at one of my clients, and they just asked me, hey, what's kind of happening, right? And I said, well, I think there's going to be a huge round of layoffs coming out, right? And lo and behold, that is what happened. But the reasoning for that was because I think a lot of companies, when COVID first started, right, and the only way to reach your audience was through digital means for a lot of different companies and a lot of different industries. And a lot of those industries hadn't put that investment in on the front end. The really advanced ones, the more mature ones, I'll say, had, right? But there were a lot of companies that hadn't, and they realized, oh no, we gotta figure this out, right? So they started heavily investing and heavily hiring. And there were even some companies, even some of the ones who recently had layoffs. I mean, you know who I'm talking about, that already had a big investment there, but they just hired at such a clip that it was untenable. It was not sustainable. And so that's going back to the conversation I was having with this person. I said, I think that's going to come to a head. And I think it's going to leave a lot of people in the position that a lot of folks are in right now. But I also said, I think that a lot of the companies that maybe weren't at a point where they could hire at that same clip that some of those bigger entities are going to start scooping up that talent, right? Now, are they going to hire 100 designers? No, right? But maybe where they were only able to at the time hire 2 or 3, they saw the value out of a commodity that was not known. And I'm just using the term commodity. I hate breaking it down to that, but it was not a known commodity, right? And they started seeing the value from it. but then they also, now they're starting to see those individuals leaving companies with big names and thinking we can get some of that talent, we can get some of that expertise into our enterprise, right? So I guess, yeah, the short answer is there are a lot of layoffs. I think there's still going to be a lot more that'll happen. That's my prediction.
Mhm.
But I think that a lot of other companies that you might not have normally thought, or maybe weren't big names that you're thinking, oh man, I've always wanted to work there, right? Um, that they're going to be opening their doors. And um, I'll kind of keep going down this track, because another thought that I have is you can go online, you can see job postings for companies that you're like, man, why would they even hire a UX designer, right? Uh, and in my opinion, I think that a lot of the companies that y'all as designers would think that about, right? They don't necessarily know. They might not know. They might not know exactly why they're hiring a UX designer. They might have just read something that said, oh, if you hire a UX designer, it can increase your not even just customer experience, but it can increase your revenue X fold because they can give you ABC, right? But they don't actually know or are mature enough in a design organization to have the wherewithal of knowing what's good and I don't want to say bad, but what's good and what's great. Okay. And the reason I bring that up is because I know there's probably a lot of folks on here who are starting their UX career, right? And that can be intimidating to join with a new company, right? But at the same time, if these companies don't necessarily know what they don't know, it gives y'all, it should empower everyone on this call to know that they can go in and make some really big changes and um, impacts to that company, because y'all will kind of be writing the playbook for that company as a UX designer. So,
That's a really
you
good
know,
insight. That's like helpful. It does feel empowering. So
good.
I like that. Kimberly asked a really great question in the chat. She asked, is it possible to work under another UX designer as an intern volunteer while I gain more experience? And how could I go about finding an opportunity about that? And so sort of the root of that question is the difficulty in trying to find real world experience to showcase on her portfolio, and any suggestions on how to obtain that.
Yeah. It's a really good question. You got me thinking now. So I'll kind of answer it in multiple parts. The first part, right? Is it possible to work under another UX designer as an intern / volunteer? Uh, I mean, I'd say absolutely, right? Now, when I say absolutely, I want to caveat that with it would be entirely dependent upon whoever that person is working for, like whatever their maturity is in their design organization, right? Um, Now, if you're trying to find somebody, maybe it's a very well-known designer who has their own LLC and they make their entire income off of what would be considered freelance work. That could be as simple as just reaching out to them and asking the question, right? Um, I think, and I'm probably going to say this a lot to a lot of a lot of the questions in my answers. It's really just about reaching out, networking, and asking those questions, and not being afraid of no, right? Um, there's a lot that I've learned just in my role, because I'm pretty much considered a salesperson, even though I hate that term. That's what a lot of my client, that's what a lot of folks think of me when they first meet me, right? But there's prospecting involved in that. And I think in the design space, there's an equal amount of prospecting, right? That doesn't just mean going and finding clients. That could mean going and finding the people that could teach you the skills, going and finding mentors, going and finding intern opportunities, and being okay with being told no, right? Now, hopefully they're nice about it when they say no. And if they're not, then that probably tells you everything right there about wanting to work with that person or not. But I say go and ask, right? Now, the chat, I'm using the chat to like stay on my train of
Yeah.
thoughts.
Okay. Yeah. No, cute. Yeah. Well, if you want,
Um,
I can chime in too if it's easier to help you
I
focus.
might need to, but
Yeah. Okay. So then kind of going off of that, you talked about reaching out to people. Somebody had also asked, so this will be a twofold question. How do you work with TEKsystems, and should we reach out to recruiters? So do you have like a specific maybe suggestion for that? And then somebody else asked, in that line of kind of thinking, what are some of the first things that you look at for a resume? So when you do reach out to a recruiter, is it helpful to maybe like send your resume with it, or just have like a simple question? What would that ask look like for somebody who's just starting out?
So I'd say definitely reach out to recruiters, right? If a recruiter is doing their job right, then they're reaching out to you. That is more a critique on my peers than anything. But at the same time, there's a lot more professionals in this skill set than there are good recruiters, I'll say, right? I don't know, there might be more recruiters these days because it's such a commoditized industry. But if a good recruiter will probably already be reaching out to you, they should be. But if they're not, or they haven't had that chance to, because we are only going off of whatever search engines, and whether it's something we've built internally, like we have at Tech, or if it's just LinkedIn, there are things that fall through the cracks there. So I just say that because never be afraid to reach out to recruiters. And even more so, probably ask other peers in the industry, even if it's not somebody you work with, it's just somebody you're connected with on LinkedIn. Ask them if they've ever had any experience with a recruiter, and trust your gut on that one, right? You'll know if you found you'll have a gut feeling of if you found a good one or not, right? And I always say trust your gut on that. As far as what we look for, I definitely look at the resume, right? But even more than that, the first thing I generally gravitate to, right, wrong, or indifferent, the first thing I gravitate towards is that portfolio. Because a resume we can work with, right? But a portfolio, and I'm not saying everyone needs to have a spotless portfolio, right? Like, it's our job. That's another point of a good recruiter. It's our job to help y'all and give y'all constructive criticism and feedback on that portfolio based on what our clients are looking for at any given time. But that is where we're going to start. So I guess what I'd say is as that being the first thing that I look for, always have one, right? Always have one ready to go, because that'll be the main thing that we're going to look at, because that's the main thing our clients are looking for.
Okay.
And resumes we can help out with. So
That makes sense. I think you might have just answered with this question with what you just said, but this seems specific to somebody's experience. Somebody asked, what are some good next steps for landing their first job for somebody who's just finished a UX boot camp? So I think maybe you might have answered it with the portfolio, but do you have any specific thoughts about that? If not, that's okay. I can keep going through the questions.
no, I do. And I think this actually goes, because I didn't want to just glaze over the second portion of Kimberly's original question, but I think that my answer will kind of tie into both of those. So when you're trying to get your first job out of a boot camp, the biggest thing is, right, and this is the conundrum for anybody who would be considered a junior in their field, right? Whether they have 20 years of work experience prior to that field in another industry, or they just got out of, I mean, some people, right, like they just got out of high school, right, and they know they want to be a designer and they go to a boot camp. What I'd say is, whenever you're in that position, there might not always be a huge amount of junior opportunities open at any given time. Because most companies, at least I know when they're coming to us, a lot of times they're coming to us for more of that senior level experienced talent that it's hard to find on their own, right? And a lot of companies that are more mature have in routes for internships, they've got so many people applying for those junior roles. So what I think about is more so what can set you apart, especially when you don't have that real world experience. And again, this is my opinion, and I'm going to be kind of blunt about it, but a lot of the clients that I work with, they love seeing the process of a conceptual case study on a portfolio, right? But that, at the end of the day, that's not necessarily real world experience when it's not a client that whether you got paid or not, when it's not somebody that you had to meet with and justify your designs with and figure out exactly what they're looking for, exactly what their users need, right? But that doesn't mean that I'm not saying it's not valuable. It is valuable because it still shows the process. But some ways to really spice that up. A big one that I've seen some people use to massive success, but I've seen a lot of folks who they might just think, I don't want to do this because you're not getting paid for it most of the time, but find nonprofits, find different organizations online, different causes online, right? And they're again kind of prospecting, even though you might not get paid for it, but you still are creating a design or creating a web page or an application, or you're doing something within the UX space with a particular user in mind and with a particular organization that you're having to answer back to. And that in and of itself is a big skill that a lot of junior designers, because they haven't had a chance to do it, don't have right off the bat, but can set you apart from a lot of the others out there. All right. If you can talk in an interview about, hey, I had to, whether you got paid for it or not, I had to sit in front of, I'll give you a real world example. Someone I know actually went to a humane society, and they were looking online. They had a passion around that already, right? They cared about that, but they were looking at the website and like, man, this is not great. And it probably wasn't because somebody who worked at the Humane Society, who's dabbled in HTML and CSS, was like, hey, we just need to get something up online. Well, they reached out to him and said, I'd love to help y'all, free of charge, right? All I'd ask is that I can include it on my portfolio and include the process of how we're doing. They're like, yeah, sure, let's go for it. And they ended up making it look beautiful, right? I couldn't tell you what the end result was. I couldn't tell you how many more animals got picked up, right? But I know that it looked beautiful, and they even included some UX around how to apply, because you have to apply for those sorts of things, right? They streamlined that process instead of just, hey, physically come out to where we're at and then fill it out in paperwork there. So I just bring that up because that's an example of where someone took the initiative. They still had to, even though that Humane Society was probably willing to take whatever they were willing to give them, they still had to sit there in front of them and just practice justifying their design choices and justifying their process. And they were able to speak to that on an interview. And it's what set them apart from other individuals who just had purely conceptual or academic case studies on their portfolio.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. I'm gonna just keep going through the questions in the chat. Somebody else asked, how do you work with TEKsystems? So it sounds like you have multiple clients you work with, but can you talk a little bit more about what it is exactly you do and how your recruiting efforts, basically how that goes?
Yeah. So technically, I'm more on the client side, right? And at TEKsystems, we have an approach where we have folks who are more client facing and the folks who are technically more candidate and consultant facing, right? And so I have teams of partners that I work with. I mean, they're not my team, right? But I work with multiple pods of people who recruit designers day in and day out. That is literally their job, is to just make them. It's not even to fill requirements. Sorry, I say recs. That's what we say internally, but not even just to fill job requirements. That's part of it. But at the core of it, their job is to network and build relationships with people in y'all's skill set. And so by doing that, right, we kind of take that split approach. I'm able to then go to whatever client I'm working with at the time and really sit down and do qualification on whatever their needs are. And there again, if I'm doing my job right, I'm not just coming to them when they have an opening and saying, okay, what are your top 3 skills? What is this initiative that y'all are working on? What is it that'll, what is the impact that this person, when they get brought on and they have success, what does that success look like? Not only for them, not only for you internally, but also for the user at the end of the day. That's all part of my job, but really, if you're asking what I should be doing day in and day out, it's still just building relationships with those clients, even if they have needs right now or not. So that way, when they do have needs, I'm able to already know a lot of those answers. I'm probably still going to have that conversation with them to make sure nothing's changed, but I should know all of those answers before they even have a need. So that way, when that need is there, I can go to my team and say, we already know what we're looking for. Let's start socializing this out to y'all's networks and figuring out who would be the best fit. And from there, it's just aligning that best fit, not just from a skills perspective, but what is the candidate looking for? I mean, it's a two-way street, right? We want to mirror up what the client is looking for and what the candidate's looking to get out of this engagement. And that's usually a successful engagement.
Wow,
Yeah.
I wish more recruiters thought like that.
You what?
I said, I wish more recruiters thought like that.
Well, okay, then now I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah.
What is what has been your experience with recruiters?
So usually, and also anyone else feel free to chime in as well, but I've had recruiters reach out and it'll kind of like go well, and then like I won't hear from them for weeks, and then be like, oh, actually, I forgot this job was filled, or like kind of like the gut-wrenching one was like, oh, we're so excited about your portfolio or your resume, and then like 10 minutes before I was supposed to have a call, they're like, we actually filled this position. Things like that. And I get that things have to work on like a fast pace, but it just would have been nice had they told me sooner. But yeah. Does anybody else have any other experiences that they want to share? Just feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I love recruiters because for a number of reasons. But Jake, you kind of earlier touched on the word commodity and Rex, and again, kind of piggybacking on what you're saying, Bianca. It's like we are a little bit of a commodity, right? And that's a two-way street. So sometimes you are part of, and again, Jake, tell me if I'm wrong. I feel like I'm a part of a recruiter's like lead pipeline, right? So sometimes you may contact them. They're going to keep you in their database. They're going to touch base with you every once in a while. But again, when you're talking about Jake, sometimes it's about the fit. And I think kind of going back, maybe it was a little bit of a two-part of that question. So Jake, let's just say I'm completely new to UX. Like, how do I get in touch with you? How do I get into your pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, the simplest way, LinkedIn. No recruiter should be not accepting a LinkedIn request from somebody in that skill set, right? And what I'd also say is, depending on the organization, the recruiting organization you're working with, right? Like I mentioned, more of that specialized approach that we have at TEKsystems, where it's I know the design recruiters, and then if somebody needs a project manager, we have project management recruiters, right? So the reason I bring that up is because if you see a recruiter on LinkedIn who's at a company that you have a good gut feeling about or have heard great things about, I wouldn't say go connect with every single recruiter out there. I would not do that, or else you're just going to get blown up with irrelevant opportunities all the time. But once you feel good about, or maybe just pick 5 random ones, right, at any given time, their job, if they are specialized, which I think most of the industry is moving towards that, they should be connecting you with the appropriate recruiter, and they should be able to stand up and say, hey, I'm not the best person to help you out, but I know somebody who is. And if I don't, I can go find out who that is through my internal network. So like I said, I think the easiest way, LinkedIn, just connect with them. Even if it's just with a simple message of, hey, I noticed you're a recruiter at XYZ company. I'd love to just get some help someday. If they don't respond to that, well, that tells you they're probably not a good recruiter.
Yeah.
Hey,
No,
Jake, hey, I had a few thoughts I wanted to share on this topic, actually, if that's okay. I actually had the pleasure of working with Jake recently. He's so amazing. I'm so glad that he's sharing all this insight with us. But on this topic, I want to share just a few tidbits from my experience in case it's helpful. I've been trying to find a job for like several months now. And so I've talked to a lot of recruiters, and I feel like it's important to kind of maybe distinguish like what I've found to be like a couple. I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to try to organize it. But like you have recruiters like Jake that are with an agency, and then you have recruiters that are within a company and they work for the company. And so that's, they're only filling that particular company's job. So someone like Jake's going to work for all these different clients, and it's really fast paced. And so I think it's really good as a candidate to not be afraid to reach out and like check in with a recruiter. If you do connect with someone, you have a good conversation, you feel good about them, check in every once in a while, and also keep a close eye on the jobs. Like these recruiters have so many placements they're trying to make, so many candidates they've talked to. And of course, they're going to do their best to like keep people top of mind. But at the end of the day, like they're just like, they have a lot going on. So like make sure that you keep an eye on the jobs that are posted. And if you see one, reach out to the recruiter right away and say, hey, I just saw this was posted. This is really interesting. It's like, don't wait for them to come to you. Like, it doesn't mean that you're not qualified. It just means that, like, it just take that initiative just to reach out to them. And I have some other thoughts if I can remember them, but I can't remember them at the moment. So maybe they'll come back, but that's been a small experience. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say, okay, is I have also talked with lots of recruiters that are not like Jake and his team, that are like cold calling. They have like very minimal details. Someone like me who's very junior, like they want to submit me to this job without talking to me for more than like 3 minutes. And I'm like, that's a red flag to me, because I don't know what the deal is, but like, it's just weird. So I feel we just kind of watch out for those types of recruiters too, because if that's been your experience so far, just know that that's not good, and that there are really great recruiters out there. So kind of like what Jake was saying earlier with the gut feeling, like you'll know when you talk to one that's good, because they're going to take a ton of time to talk to you about your experience and like really get to know you, and like really, you know, like the thing that they say of like, well, I'll think of you, or I'll put you in the pipeline. Like, it's true. They will. I've seen that. So I'll stop now. Thanks.
No, I think that's great. I think you bring up a great point. And somebody else asked in the chat, Jake, would you mind mentioning some red flags for fake recruiters or green flags for good recruiters?
Yeah. So actually, before I answer that, I want to put one little tidbit in there based on what Caitlin was saying about keeping an eye on the jobs. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something I should have admittedly said. And maybe this actually kind of goes into the answer to this question as one of the bullet points. But when you're looking at jobs, because yes, we do have a ton, right? And especially the bigger organizations you work with, the more openings that they're going to have, the more people they're going to know, the bigger their network, right? But if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I saw this job posting at here locally, we'll say HEB, right? I know I have some peers that work with HEB. I know I personally don't work with HEB, but even if that doesn't necessarily impact me, or even if it's a full-time role, I can make any connections back to HEB for this person, or even just give them some insight on, hey, here's what they've looked for in the past when we have had opportunities. I want to do that, right? And I think, as one of the bullet points to this question, a good recruiter should be okay with doing that. It shouldn't necessarily only be something that they're going to have the opportunity to fill. Maybe they would have the opportunity to fill it, and they just, for whatever reason, didn't make that connection, right? We're all humans, and we have our faults there. But at the bare minimum, a good recruiter should go out of their way to try and figure out whatever information they can that's going to help you get further in your career, right? Not just somebody that's going to help them make a placement and potentially just be placed and forgotten. So I'll keep going down the line of good recruiter and then red flags. I think good recruiters should be able to explain not just what you can read on a job posting. And the sad truth is, there's a lot of that goes on in our industry. And I'll even be the first to admit, there have been times where I might not, because maybe I don't have quite the relationship with one design director that I do with another, where I'm just going off of what I have, right? But I should at least be able to admit that to you and not make it seem like I'm trying to embellish on a role that they're just reading from an opening, right? They're just reading from something that you could go find online yourself, right? Another thing that I try and pride myself on is equipping the recruiting partners I do work with of understanding like the why behind the work, and so the work, because I think that's even more than what you get on a lot of job postings. A lot of job postings, you just get a list of tasks and deliverables, and then some tools or years of experience that somebody needs to have, right? It says 5 years. That's probably my favorite one. And I say that jokingly. But 5 years of UX experience. I'm like, okay, well, but doing what and why? And what is that going to do? Again, not only for the client, right? Not only because I mean most companies are in it to make money, right? So what is it going to do? I think of it as make money, save money, or mitigate some sort of risk. You can break down why a company is doing something almost every time to one of those three things, right? But then also like, what is that doing for the user, the customer, right? And then what does that also provide? How can we sell this to a candidate by showing them how this will provide what they're looking for? And that brings me to my next bullet of a good recruiter. I like to boil everything down when we're having conversations with candidates. And I did this when I was in the recruiting role, like the specific recruiting role as well, is skills, goals, and interests, right? It's definitely going to go further than that. But I think as long as you can go from that line of questioning and learn what a person's current skills are, what skills they want to have in the future, which really ties into their goals, but not even just goals of their skills, but also what are their goals personally, right? What are their goals professionally and personally? And y'all can decide how in-depth y'all want to get with that, right? But a good recruiter will try and learn that and understand that about you. And then also just their interests, right? What are the companies that they like to work for? Does somebody like healthcare? Like, is that something that they're really passionate about? Is somebody passionate about banking? Is somebody passionate about retail and e-commerce, right? Is somebody more passionate about AI and where that's going? I just say that because I'm kind of currently nerding out on a lot of AI stuff and I love it. But really, it's those skills, those goals, and those interests. And if you can learn those three things and then build from that foundation, that's where a successful placement will come from. And I'm going to keep saying successful placement, even though I hate thinking of it that way. It's just probably the easiest term to use without me explaining it like this every single time. But to me, a successful placement is not, and a good recruiter should think of it this way, right? A successful placement is not a body in a seat, is not a number to add to the head count, is not a dollar amount that you have to track from a budgetary perspective. A successful placement is when you've married up that duality of what a client is looking for out of somebody and what their goals are, and then what that candidate is looking for in their next client that they're supporting and what their goals are. So those are just some, I'll probably think of more things a good recruiter should do as we go along. As far as a bad recruiter, the opposite of everything I just said. Somebody who thinks of y'all as just a name, sometimes not even that, but more so like a body, right? That's why I said I hate using that word commodity. It was just the only thing that could come to mind. We're all people, right? We're all people with different backgrounds, different interests, different things that we want to accomplish in this life. And a good recruiter should be willing, and not just willing, but wanting to understand that about someone. Even if that means there's been people that I've worked with. Well, I say work with, I've never placed them once, right? There's one, I'm not going to go into names, but there's one, this literally just happened for a role that we were trying to fill for one of our clients. And, budget ended up falling through because of things that are going on right now. And that's going to happen, right? But I've known him for 8 years. Yeah, I met him my first year doing this job. I've known him for 8 years, never placed him once. But we've had breakfast with each other multiple times. We've met up and talked about life and family and what he is looking for. And we finally, just like 2 weeks ago, found something. And I reached out to him and said, dude, I think I got it. I think I've got one. And we're finally going to get to work together. And it didn't work out. And that's okay, because we have that foundation of trust that we've built because from all those years of never working with each other. And I've always told him, man, if you find a role that you're looking for and it's not something we support, still tell me about it, right? I mean, I want to try and set you up for the most success. I also firmly believe what goes around comes around, right? And good people know good people. So a good recruiter should think that way as well when interacting with each and every one of y'all. And a bad recruiter will be one that just does reach out to you and say, hey, I've got a job. You look like on your resume, you meet the top requirements that they're looking for. Can I get your last 4 of your social and your date of birth and then get you submitted over there? Right? Like that. If that happens, run. Okay. Or hey, if the pay's enough and you want to take a shot on it, go for it. I'm not going to say don't do it, but I wouldn't expect anything more from that recruiter after you're placed. Another good thing that I think a good recruiter versus a bad recruiter will do is once you're already out there, are they still following up with you? Are they still reaching out to see how things are going? Are they asking, hey, what's going well? What's not going well? How can I help out? Right? Maybe there isn't anything they can do. But there again, that's going to happen, but they should at least be offering that and finding out if there's any one thing, even if it's just to be a sounding board because you're venting because your new boss isn't listening to what you're saying, right? Like they should be reaching out and building that relationship and that rapport with you. So that's kind of my answer on that one.
I think that's a great answer. And those are some excellent green flags to look out for. I'm going to bring it back to the chat to some of the initial questions that I passed over just for flow of conversation. But Gemma asked, I have a job in UX that I love, but I want to get into the habit of keeping my portfolio up to date. What would you recommend I make sure I include when I'm predominantly a UX researcher and copy editor rather than a designer?
Okay, good question. I'm going to ask that person, do you want to be a UX designer or do you want to stay in UX research and copy editing? No right or wrong answer. That's going to influence my direct answer for this question.
I'm a bit of a generalist, but I do prefer doing the research over the design, but I do a little bit of everything, but research and copy is my main job.
Perfect. All right. Then what I'd say is kind of going back to, well, how do I keep my portfolio up to date? And I hope I'm summing up that question correctly. Really, it's how do I keep it up to date and what do I need to keep looking out for, right?
Yeah, that sounds good. Sorry, I keep muting myself because my cat's meowing.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm hearing that correctly.
Yes.
Then what I always tell folks is build out your portfolio for the job that you want. I mean, you want to be honest about the job you have now. I think a lot of the resume comes into that, right? And that's where y'all actually have an upper hand versus a lot of other types of skill sets out there, because y'all kind of have a twofold way of showing what you have done, which is where the resume is at. And then showing what you have done on the portfolio, but also using that as an opportunity to display what you want to do by taking some extra steps and putting some extra items in there. For a researcher, right, I think the biggest thing you could include, and this all depends on like NDAs and maybe things that you may or may not be able to include, right? So I get that. And that happens in design itself as well. But I think a big thing is, especially for research, case studies. And I love case study formats on portfolios, right? In fact, I don't think he'd mind. I can probably find the one that I typically use when I'm working with somebody who's newer, or I want to show them, hey, this is, you don't have to copy it, right? But this is a great example of a case study layout for a portfolio or for any given project on a portfolio. I just think when it comes to research specifically, right, that's more almost even like, and again, I don't know if you can share it, but like as close to a white paper as you could get, right? You almost have to go more in depth with your wording versus your visuals when it's on the research side than you do on the design side. Now, I say that, and I'm sure somebody on this call is gonna be sitting there and thinking, no, that's like, I have plenty of both on mine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But that's why I ask, well, what do you want to do? Because that I just say that a portfolio, as you're keeping it up to date, is a great way of also displaying some other skills that maybe your current job or past jobs didn't expressly ask you to do. But here's how you either A, would have done it if it had asked you to expressly do that, or here's how I was able to include the skills that I want to use more in my next job in my past jobs. I know I kind of jumped around a little bit there, so I hope that
No, that's great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Y'all are going to learn that about me. If y'all haven't by now, I jump around quite a bit. So if you ever need to rein me back in, I apologize.
That is okay by me. I do lots of jumping around too. Okay, going back to the chat. Octavia asks, are doing design challenges a good experience to add to a portfolio? And then on top of that, how often are recruiters seeking UI only designers?
So the first part of that question, thinking how I want to answer that. The easy answer is yes, they are great things to do, right? But I also want to point out that depending on the design challenge, and I would say a majority of design challenges that are issued out there kind of goes back to what I was saying about conceptual versus academic, or not conceptual and academic versus real world experience. I don't think that they're definitely not the only thing you should include. Now, as you're building up your portfolio, that might be all you have an opportunity to do at the time, right? So yes, absolutely do it. But as time goes on, try to find opportunities to where that's not the only thing that you have included on there. Because it might not, in a manager's mind, like maybe if you're working with a recruiter, they're able to talk through that, and they should be able to talk through that and almost, for lack of a better term, sell you over to that manager or that director. But if you're having to do that on your own, which there's a lot of folks that find their jobs on their own, I mean, most majority of them do, that if that's all you have on there, it doesn't necessarily set you apart. Now, I'm also going to say it could end up setting you apart, again, if it's not the only thing you have on there, because if you're doing design challenges, but you also have some real world work on there, or even if it's like I was bringing up just an example of nonprofits, that also shows passion. So that can go a long way as well. It really, at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet to any of these things. It all depends on the manager, director, whatever title you're going and interviewing with. It all depends on what they're looking for. And that is where, well, not to do the plug, but recruiters should really be able to help out in that regard, because they should be able to make you not just another piece of paper in a resume, not even just another website as a portfolio. They should be able to express to this hiring person who you are, what you're looking for, how you got to where you're at today, the skills that you have on that resume, on that portfolio, and be able to answer any questions. Or if not, if they don't know, I mean, they're not going to know everything. So if they don't know it, say, hey, you know what? That's a great question, hirer. Let me go find that out for you, right? And be that advocate for you. They're like a talent agent in a way, except they're one you don't have to pay. So I guess I'll add that to a red flag of bad recruiters. Do not pay recruiters. All right. Like, you should not. I mean, maybe if it's like executive search firm or something like that for somebody trying to go to like a CEO job, maybe that could come into play. I don't think you should ever have to pay recruiters. That's just my opinion, though. So.
Okay. Des asks, how do you display or present an NDA project or tell about what you have done for a company when a company such as a government or financial doesn't allow any file transfer or emails to save for your portfolio work?
Yep. I was waiting for that one. That's always a tricky situation, right? And even if it's not government, like there are a lot of companies that have NDAs to where you're not allowed to show that sort of stuff. And I will say there's a lot of designers who still do. I wouldn't just, this is not me suggesting to do that. I'm just saying some people still do. But if you're really following the rules, right, and don't want any sort of legal ramifications down the line, I think, and this could even be a skill in and of itself, is being able to still tell a story when you can't give the data points, right? Well, okay, I'll give this. It's not exactly the same, but I think the thought process could be applicable here. Like when I work with my clients, I'm not allowed to share with client A exactly what I did with client B, right? Even if it's something as simple as rate structures, right? Because I get a lot of my clients are like, hey, what are the current going rates for people in this skill set right now, right? We want to make sure we're staying competitive and being able to attract and retain that talent, right? So it's a twofold battle for them. But what I will do is I'll say, hey, it's a large coffee distributor headquartered out of Seattle, Washington, right? So I'm giving answers. I'm giving them insight on to build credibility on who else is hiring people at X salary range or X rate range, but I can't give the exact name. I can't give the exact details. So I just bring that up because I think in a portfolio, and it's not easy to do, you can still show your process. You can still show what you went through with that company or with that client. You probably can't say, something like increased revenue by X% and give the exact details on a portfolio. Generally speaking, you can on an interview. That's all dependent upon how much information you feel comfortable sharing. But I don't know if that really answered your question. I know that that's a tricky thing that we always have to work through with a lot of individuals. And sometimes it is restructuring that case study or that portfolio to almost like eliminate very discrete terminology that would identify a company or that's trademarked by a company, but you can still explain your process when working at that company. You can still explain how you got from point A to point B, and you should feel comfortable doing that. The other thing I'll say, when in doubt, reach out to another either designer or reach out to a recruiter and say, hey, do you think this is okay for me to share? Right. Yeah, that's a hard one to answer because I think it's also case by case a lot of times.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's tough. Okay, so another question that was asked is kind of talking about the timeline of jobs. So there's so many jobs out there and so many of them being filled so quickly. Is it smart to only focus on jobs that have been posted very recently, like a week maximum, versus applying to jobs that have been posted for maybe about a month? It says, I feel like it depends. Jobs with agencies seem to fill very quickly, so you must apply quickly, whereas jobs with corporations that have their own internal recruiters may take several months to actually fill, from the first recruiter screening to extending the offer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So when I found that in the chat, so I'm gonna try and answer that like question by question. With so many jobs out there and so many being filled so quickly, smart to only focus on jobs that have been posted recently. Yes, I think focusing on the more recent ones is you're more likely to have some sort of response on the most recent ones. Now, twofold to that, everyone else is probably thinking that as well. And that means that unless you applied 30 minutes after that thing was posted, you're probably in a resume stack that could be, easily 100, 200 people long already. And I will say most hirers on average, and we've asked them this, we've done surveys on our clients. Most hirers, when they're going through that, when they get resumes submitted over for any job, whether it's contract or full-time, they'll usually take the first 25 and then they'll usually spend about, I'd say 60 seconds is a long time. It's usually more like 15 to 20 seconds skimming through it and seeing if some keywords, buzzwords popped up on there. And then they'll pick 5 out of those 25 and say, okay, well, let's at least talk to these people. I highlight that because, again, when you're working with an agency, they should be able to help you get to the top of that stack. I know competitors of mine at clients that we support a new rec will come out and they'll submit 15 people within an hour, right? Whether they talk to these people or not, who knows? They're in their database. They have all the required information that they need to submit them, so they submit them. And then they'll call that person if that individual ends up getting shortlisted, right? And all the other people who don't, they probably never even found out that they were ever submitted to that role, right? Whereas the approach that I try and take, it's really, if I'm being honest, it's more of a 2.5 to 1 ratio. I try to do 2 to 1 ratio, and that means 2 candidates to 1 role, right? I try. Now that doesn't mean I only talk to 2 people, right? Like hopefully we're talking to like 30 to 50 people for that role. But I try to really identify, okay, who are the top 2 that I think are probably going to get this role or have the best shot at it, and go from there. And then if we have to reassess because that didn't work out, cool, then I'll go back and I'll revisit some of the other people. But I try to narrow it down to where somebody, at least when I'm presenting them, is 1 of 2 max, right? So where does that tie into trying to look at old postings versus new postings. There again, you're going to be a part, unless you're working with someone who's an advocate on your behalf, you're going to be a part of that big giant and bigger stack even than what most recruiting companies will put in there. The older requirements, I won't say don't ever go for those, right? Because y'all can see a lot of requirements, especially full-time requirements, stay open for a very long time. So always take your shot on those, you know. And sometimes you actually might end up putting yourself kind of at the top of the stack because maybe that's been more of a forgotten rec by the community, not by the person hiring for it, but by the community applying to it. And so you might actually end up getting yourself popped up to the top of that just by taking that shot at that company. I guess at the end of the day, it's really more so if wherever you're applying for, however long a rec has been out, make sure it's also somebody you don't want to waste your time just applying to 100 different places. I'm not saying waste your time. I recognize that there are people who are in the position where I need to get the job, right? I need a job. So I'm fully aware of that. If you're in a position where you're able to be a little bit more picky, make sure it's somewhere that you really want to work at before just going and applying to all those places.
That's a good short answer. Yeah. So we're kind of close to out of time. Is that right, Adrian? Should we be wrapping up?
I can keep going
Actually,
to 8 o'clock if y'all want to. Yeah, it's
yeah, I looked, and so we are going till 8.
Okay, perfect.
Bianca.
Never mind. Never mind.
So I was thinking we can keep going till like maybe 7:50, and then we'll do the wheel of names.
Yeah,
But
great.
I think we've got a lot of questions. So
Me too. Yeah.
but I don't want to steal all of Jake's time because he has a little one that he's going to take care of. So but I'm game to keep it open as long as you guys want to keep it open for. So
Okay,
that's all
Jake.
I got to say.
It's up to you. Yeah. Do you want to keep going and keep going through the chat questions? Do you want to share extra information you've been wanting to share, or
let's
how do you?
keep going through the chat questions because
Okay.
a
Yeah.
lot of
Great.
the extra information I have here has been brought up through the answers. So this is
Okay.
good.
Great. Okay. So Octavia asks, how do I make myself memorable at interviews besides what's on the resume and portfolio?
It's a good question. I think like okay, I'm just going to assume that everybody on this job and anybody who's wanting to be either is in UX design or just probably spent money to go through a course and get certified or whatever, whatever you want to call it, right? Like y'all put in work to be a UX designer. That takes passion. Let that passion come through. I always tell folks interviewing is a skill in and of itself. I have had times where I've heard that somebody was too passionate, right? They were just so much energy, so much. But to me, that also goes back to if you are that super passionate person and you are a high energy person, or even if you're not as exuberant in that, there's nothing wrong, right? There's no right or wrong about it, but let the passion that you do have come through but be yourself, be authentic, right? I think I talked about this like when we were talking about like the conversation I had about 8 months ago before this call got started. That was something I said was be authentic in yourself, and whatever your passion level around this field or an industry that you can do this field in, wherever your passion lies, be authentic around that, because at the end of the day, if you don't on the interview and you fake it, it's going to probably come up at some point once you're actually out on that job. And that might be an indicator of maybe this isn't a place you really want to work, right? So yeah, I mean that's like but that's kind of a layup answer, if I'm being critical of myself on, be passionate, show energy, but I do think it's important. I think the other way to make yourself memorable on an interview is like go in there knowing, and maybe it takes practice with some folks, right? But go in there being confident to speak on at least 2 to 3 of your projects that are on your portfolio without looking at your portfolio, right? Not a lot of people, I'm not gonna say not a lot of people. I've known a lot of people who that's hard for them, or that they either can't do it, they don't want to take the time to do that, or it's just they haven't learned the skill of being able to do that yet. But oh, sorry, were you gonna say something? Oh,
No,
okay.
no, I was trying to copy and paste and I messed
Gotcha.
up.
But I think the more you can speak to the work you've done without necessarily having to have that portfolio in front of you, it's going to make you very memorable, at least on the folks in the interviews that I've set it in on and seen. And then another big thing is being able to, in a case study, really should be able to describe this as well, but being able to talk about what not only the users got out of it, right? I mean, you definitely have to, you're in UX, you have to be able to speak to what the benefit for the users was, right? But then how did that tie back into an end goal for the client itself, right? It's kind of playing a balance game between the user's goals, as well as the business's goals for the users, because it's going to do usually one of those three things I mentioned earlier: making money, saving money, or mitigating some sort of risk, right? There's definitely a lot more that goes into this space. I almost hesitate to break it down by those three things, because especially in a field like design, there's a lot of empathy involved, there's a lot of feeling involved, and that needs to be there. But I think when a company's listening to what you can bring to them, majority of the time they have a goal in mind that's tied back to, at least here in America, right, like making money, mitigating risk, or saving some form of money.
I have a specific question. So I currently have a day job and it's great, pays bills, but on my LinkedIn, it's very much my day job, stuff that I've done in the past, and not anything about UXR. Now I have my portfolio and obviously my like UXR resume that's specific to UX stuff. So the point is I'm trying to transition. How would you go about, or do recruiters kind of see that as a red flag when your LinkedIn doesn't match your resume or your portfolio? And the reason being is because I work for the government and I really shouldn't be doing other things.
Yeah.
So that's like not the excuse, but like I massaged it in such a way where I'm like, oh, I do this for the government and I also do these things which are UX are like, therefore it's just
Yeah.
not listed on my LinkedIn. Your
No,
thoughts about that?
so to answer that, I think, is it a red flag? No. Will it inherently limit the amount of recruiters that might proactively reach out to you to strike up that conversation and get to know your skills, goals, and interests? Maybe. Yeah. The hard part with that is, if especially in a scenario like yours, I don't know what you're risking. I mean, I'm there is risk there. I don't know exactly what that risk is, right? But if you're not allowed to do it, then yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would do it. So what I'd say is, it's not a red flag, but it might take, kind of going back to what we were talking about reaching out to recruiters, it might take some
Like the extra
extra.
initiative on my part. Okay, I can handle that. I'm okay with
Yeah,
that.
like at the end of the day, you know what you want to do,
Right,
right?
right.
Not everyone can be mind readers, or let's say LinkedIn readers of understanding, oh, this person has this, maybe they want to do design as well, right?
Right.
But I think it shouldn't be a red flag once that conversation has been started.
Happens. Yeah. Okay. That's reassuring. Christina in the chat asks, what would you look for in a UI designer portfolio?
So that one is a little harder for me to answer with like confidence that I have some of the others, simply because I do know that, there is a delineation between UI and UX. I am not as knowledgeable when it comes to that. What I will say is, on the UI side, and I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, is just, I'm going to give my best answer here, right? And hey, for anyone wondering that, right, please feel free to connect with me, and I can connect you with somebody who is much more knowledgeable in that specific space and can help you out there. What I would say, if I were just looking at it, I'd want to see more like examples of where the user, not to use the word itself, but what a user interaction was like, what maybe some of the data points behind what the user interaction was like before you started working with them and then after you started working with a client. There might be more visuals involved than like hard visuals versus like of end products or beginning products and end products versus like the maybe the research that went into it as well. Maybe more of the intangibles that you get from doing UX. I almost don't even want to keep going because I don't want to say the wrong things, but like I said, I'm more than willing to admit when I don't know something there. And I apologize for not having the answer for y'all on that one. But I can definitely get y'all, whoever's wondering that, in contact with people who could answer that much better than me. I hope
Okay,
that's all right.
great. Yeah, no, thank you. For context, Christina asked that. So Christina, if you just want to direct message Jacob, or Jake, sorry. So there's another question in the chat that, let me keep scrolling. David asked, for those more on the research side, and to the extent that you can generalize, have you been seeing a shift towards generalist roles? My rough observation has been that research roles are more scant the last couple months, but that's just me.
I have seen an increase in, and it irks me, I will admit, but I've seen an increase in companies who are, I'll back up, right? I think if you went 7-9 years ago, heck, even 5 years ago, when before design really started getting its heyday in the sun like it has now, I think that a lot of people were looking for that quote unquote unicorn, right? When I hear generalist, I hear unicorn. I hear people wanting that that person who can do it all, right? The problem with that is I don't think a lot of companies really understand, like, there's only so much that someone can do, right? And if you're saying you want a generalist, you might run the risk of finding somebody who it's the concept of like a T, right? They can get super wide across, but how deep can they get in any one specific aspect? And I'm not saying someone who's a generalist can't. I'm just saying more often than not, the design directors when they say that they want a generalist, they're looking for somebody not like as at a T, not even just at a line. They're looking for somebody who's like a whole block, right? They want somebody who's got expertise in all of these aspects. And that's not fair, first off, but it's also not realistic more often than not. I say all that because we started to see a shift away from that. And we started seeing people who were, even delineating between service design, product design, interaction design, UX research itself as a practice. And that was really, really cool to see. But now I feel like, especially with where the economy's at and people trying to get their, or clients trying to get bang for buck, right? We are seeing more of a shift kind of back towards that generalist. I don't think that's going to be very tenable. And I don't think it's going to be how it used to be. I think that, again, it kind of goes back to how mature is the design practice and the design organization at a company. But I am seeing more of that. And I think the companies who are asking for that are either going to get really lucky in whoever they hire, or they're going to bring someone on expecting the world, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work out how they want it to work out. Now, will that be put back on the individual who got the job? Maybe unfairly, right? But it might. But yeah, that's been kind of what I've seen, is like an accordion effect of where it used to be like that, then it got away from that. Now it's somewhat kind of going back to that, while also not fully to the degree it was before. But if you want to be, I'll also say, if you want to be more of that generalist, then heck yeah, go for those sorts of roles, right? But if you really want to get specific in on one aspect that and hone your craft to the nth degree in that one aspect, I would not necessarily go towards those roles, because a lot of times it could just be somebody trying to maximize what they're getting out of somebody without quite frankly probably paying them what they should be paying them to be a true generalist. So
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm gonna keep going through yeah, okay. So Caitlin asks, my experience in a boot camp kind of advertised to look for journalist roles. I'm implying it's easier to break in that way, but it sounds like those might be more high level. Yeah, so you basically answered that.
There was one that I think we might have
Skimmed over.
skimmed over, but it looks like it was also answered by others in the chat. But I thought maybe you should just bring it up for Jake. So it
Yeah.
came up where sometimes recruiters are asking for a candidate's last four of their social security numbers. So there's a little bit kind of side chatter about that. So it's a little bit of a security concern. One person said that's just so that they can tell you apart from somebody with the same last name. And then somebody else said, oh, I just give them fake numbers. So maybe if you could answer that. Sorry. And I'll.
Yeah. So the clear answer is like, do we have to have that? Like just to work with us? No. But there are still VMSs out there that we have to work with sometimes because we're working with a certain client. There's still other, applicant tracking systems. And yes, that is the easiest way. Most tracking systems, when they're asking for that or when a recruiter's asking for that, it is so that they can figure out, are you the same person of the same name that maybe we hired or that left us a year ago and is trying to come back? And I don't say that negatively, right? But they do need to do their due diligence and make sure that has this person worked here before, or are they a different person than another individual who submitted to another role out here? What I'd say in terms of if somebody's asking you for that, just going back to that trust factor with a recruiter, if you have not had conversations with that recruiter and you don't know specifically what you're getting submitted for, and you don't feel good even when they've told you what you're getting submitted for, right? You still feel a little like, this just doesn't, they weren't able to tell me enough to make me feel good. Do not give them that information, right? Now, the biggest hiring client here in San Antonio, and for people who are in San Antonio, you'll know who I'm talking about, right? It's a very military focused insurance company. I have to have that info in order to submit you. So I'm going to ask for that every single time. But I also wouldn't expect a candidate to just give me that because I called them up and said, hey, I've got a role for you. You look like you'd be a good fit. All I'll need is this information and whatever you're looking to get paid. Good? Okay, cool. No, that you should never feel comfortable just handing that information over. And another thing is I do know, I won't, yeah, I mean, I'm never going to talk about my specific competitors, but I know that there are competitors out there who will just garner that information, throw it in the database, and have you ready to just have you in a list of individuals. Going back to that, hey, they're submitting 15, I'm submitting 2. They'll just have you in that list of individuals for that way. Whenever another role does open up, boom, they just submit you to that role. You may or may not know it. You may actually be working with another recruiter on that same role, but because they just clicked send right away because they had your information, now it's either you're not going to get to work with the recruiter you wanted to, or you might just be removed from consideration for that role because it looks like you were double submitted, right? It looks like you're playing the field, and that's not the case more often than not, but that's what it looks like to an applicant tracking system that is a machine at the end of the day and not a person. So yeah, I would say, is it weird when people ask for it? No, it's very common. There are even other way, like month and date of birth. There are other identifying factors that people might need because of the system they're having to work in, and you're not going to get around that, right? But you should feel comfortable when giving that information based on the previous conversations you've had.
I have a question about timelines of finding jobs right now. When you're working with a recruiter, what is that timeline looking like? Is it dependent on the industry that you're looking in, or is it just dependent on like time of the year right now? With like, if you're actively like applying to like 5 jobs a week or whatever it might be, what can that look like for somebody who's in the job market?
When you're saying timeline, I just want to make sure I'm answering from the right perspective. You're saying like timeline of getting in touch with a recruiter to getting the job. and start
Yeah,
the job.
let's use that context.
So there's no easy answer there. Everyone's journey is different, right? Like, and I'm sure people here have examples of this, right? I know one of my favorite stories is Sherry's. I know she's not able to be on right now, but Sherry's story around this, because there's been times where it didn't take very long, and then there were times where it did take longer, right? It all just kind of, it does depend on whatever the economy's like at a given time. It depends on other market factors like, let's say, holiday rush for retail, right? And they have an influx of needs for contingent labor. That's just one example, but there's an outside market factor that could make things either more urgent or less urgent. And then there's the example I gave of that person I was talking about that I've known for 8 years and never once was able to place him, but I've been able to help him in other ways and still build that relationship with him to where, and I could text him right now, right? And we could have a conversation about what's going on in life. So there's no silver bullet around the timeline. Now, what I can say is timeline of once you've already been submitted, right? Not working with a recruiter, right? Because that could take long time, and a good recruiter is going to like welcome that and nurture that, right? Once you've been submitted to a role, that's a little different. In my eyes, a role should not, well, really a role shouldn't take any more than like a week and a half to 2 weeks from beginning to end. Maybe I'm a little, it's just because I push that with my clients. But most, probably within the range of two weeks to 4 weeks being a long time. But I think, you know, if you can get it down to 2 weeks, that's usually pretty good. I mean, if I like, let's say I find somebody, I qualify a role on a Monday, we go and find it. I usually tell clients like, hey, okay, we've qualified this, unless we have a pipeline built out and we have a relationship with this person where I know exactly what they're looking for. I'd say, all right, give me and my team 72 hours, and then I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to show you data around the people we've talked to, the amount of people we've talked to. Hopefully we have some individuals in mind to be able to sell over to that individual. I'm using internals, like I hate saying sell, but like to present, right? And then explain why you need to interview this person. And then if I don't have those people, it's also on me to explain what the market analytics look like and why we haven't been able to find somebody who maybe fits for what their role is looking for, or fits the pay range, or whatever's holding us back, right? And be able to explain that to them. But let's do ideal scenario. We find some folks after 72 hours, present them over, then I am pushing that client, like, you need to interview them. Ideally a 1 step. There's a lot of folks who still do 2 steps. Some do 3. And I'm just like, all right, it's not going to work. Like, good luck. I mean, sometimes it will, but it's odds are somebody's going to find another role before those 3 interviews are up. But that's exactly why I push to have interviews done within 5 business days, right? Now, depending on the time of the week, that we could have to push it out, depending on if there's, you know, planning meetings going on for the entire team, then that's just something we have to overcome. But yeah, I think if you can knock out the entire interview process within 5 business days, usually that's enough time to figure out who you're really looking for and talk to a good enough amount of candidates, but also not too much time to where you run the risk of that candidate finding another role, and then that client missing out on that good candidate because of that. So I just say all that for context as to why I gave the answer 2 weeks.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's an excellent timeline. I have never had that timeline, but it sounds like nice to me. So
I don't want to say I can keep them to it every single time, right? Like, there's still people as well, and they're going to do what they want to do, but that's my reasoning, and I will explain it to every client.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah.
But sometimes also too, like once the offer comes in, like especially with tech, sometimes they want like a drug screen and a background screen too.
Yeah.
So
I should say 2 weeks for the offer being made.
Yeah.
Then background, drug screen, whatever else is maybe needed based on the industry or the client, that's going to add. I usually tell folks 2 weeks, sometimes sooner, sometimes later. I meant 2 weeks from
from getting into
presenting to offer being made.
Yeah.
that makes sense. Okay, so we are at 7:51. I think we pretty much got to all the questions in the chat, so that's great. Thank you so much for your time and for just allowing us to ask you whatever we wanted.